How do you become an off-ramp for yourself and for others? I'm Carla McLaren. Welcome to episode 16 of the Off-Ramp Project, where I bring together each of the subjects that we focused on in the previous episodes in order to talk about how you become an off-ramp for yourself in terms of being able to get yourself out of a troubling situation and not staying there forever because you committed to it or because other people saw you commit to it and you wouldn't want to look silly, or you're not listening to your own emotions saying something's wrong here. And how do you become an off-ramp for others? I'm almost thinking you have to learn to be an off-ramp for yourself first, meaning that you are aware of your foibles. You are aware of times when you go into cognitive dissonance, and you can pull yourself back and say, no, there's two competing ideas here, and I'm holding on to one really, really strong, and I need to cool my jets and see what's going on, right? Or when you are stuck in a behavior, learning how to pull yourself out of trouble and give yourself an off-ramp when you are headed in the wrong direction for the wrong reason with the wrong intentions, right? To be able to pull back and say, whoa, okay, we need to reset here. That pulling back, that whoa, that is your internal moral compass, which is moderated by your own intrinsic shame. Shame is one of the most crucial emotions you have. It's a crucial social emotion. And sadly, we've been chased away from shame, and it hasn't done us any good. So working well with your shame is a way to make sure that when you get off of your track, when you're following the values of somebody else, or when you're following values that are going to, drop you right off a cliff, that you can pull yourself back before you plummet over the cliff. And so I talked about shame. I actually did 2 episodes on shame. They were episodes 12 and 13 about reclaiming your shame and working with your own shame, not the shame that people put on you. You're not tall enough, you're not strong enough, you're not weak enough, you're not short enough, you're not whatever they need you to be so they can control you. Rather, this is the shame that comes from inside you and says, I want to be an upright person. I want to live up to my word. I want, right, the things that you want, the things that make sense to you. Working with your shame is a way to become an off-ramp for yourself, so you don't spin off. And we know, even though people have told us for decades to not have shame, only have guilt, it's nonsense. But we know that shame is necessary because the word shameless is not something to aspire to. It's not a state that any of us looks at and thinks, I want to be shameless, right? So we know how important shame is, and focusing on shame will be a way to help you become an off-ramp for yourself, because it's very easy to get caught up in this time of extreme emotional manipulation, extreme, constant, regular emotional manipulation that doesn't even look like manipulation. It looks like everybody who agrees with me also agrees that everybody who doesn't agree with me is evil, or at the very least, they're a fool, or they're, what was that saying? Low information voters. Wow, that's a way to talk about people in rudeness. I think understanding that we are being manipulated by social media, we've been manipulated by advertising for, 100 or more years. And we kind of came in on this sort of pillow of manipulation. And I think I talked about the times, remember that time when Russian and Ukrainian operatives got onto Facebook and Twitter and, wherever else, and were throwing false news stories. They were just made up. They were starting false businesses. They had hundreds or thousands of false profiles. and they would come into the conversations and the Facebook feeds and the Twitter feeds of Americans to specifically manipulate them and cause chaos in our country. How did that do? That went really well. And one of the reasons it went so well is because they knew who we were and what our pre-existing problems were. We showed them our vulnerabilities and they capitalized on them. In endstage capitalism, remember, everything's for sale. Your emotions, your attention, your body, everything is for sale. So maintaining a distance from social media, becoming very emotionally, not just intelligent, we went way past that. We need to be emotional geniuses and to be able to look at what's coming at us and saying, oh, what emotion are they throwing at me? And what emotion do they want me to feel? And do I agree? Right? I think most people get drawn into emotional manipulation because they haven't even learned to be able to name the emotion that's coming at you and name the emotion that's expected of you. And then notice that you have an option. You get to say what happens to your emotions. In episode 2, I called that one, Your Emotions Are Not for Sale, right? In episodes 9 through 14, I talked about specific emotions that are being manipulated right now and how that works politically and how it works in terms of our social and civic lives, and who is trying to get us to feel those emotions. I talked about stress, which is an emotional response. It's not a separate thing. I talked about panic and shame. I talked about depression. And I talked about, did I say hatred? Because hatred's a good one. But also I talked to 2 authors in episode 15 who wrote a book called Beyond the Politics of Contempt. And contempt is hatred. And we've all been manipulated into a politics of contempt and hatred. And so the authors of the book, Doug Teschner and Beth Mallow, we talked about what you can do. Where do you go to get responsible, unbiased news that isn't just pushing your buttons all the time and ramping you up, right? Who can we follow? Who can give us information that would be worthwhile? How do we make steps toward becoming an off-ramp instead of a kind of a patsy who has been manipulated into a political position? It didn't start with the Russian and Ukrainian operatives in 2015 or 2016, but they showed that it could be done, and very easily, that you could manipulate a whole country if you could get yourself onto their social media. So whatever social media you're looking at, know that you have a choice about what you feel, and you have a choice about whether you allow people to throw emotion at you, right? There's a lot of really hot emotional broadcasting all throughout social media where people come on and they're throwing frustration at you, they're throwing panic, they're throwing depression, they're throwing sarcasm, which is anger, they're throwing they want you to take up their mission and go forward as a crusader. They want you to distrust people. They want you to dehumanize people. Those nutty Democrats, those nutty, Republicans. And nutty, you can take any really rude word and put it where I put nutty. And see, are you saying that every single person who votes Democratic feels this way and is this way? Are you saying that every single person who votes as a Republican feels this way and is this way, right? Because that is absolute nonsense. But if someone's throwing a lot of emotion at you and a lot of manipulation, it's sometimes easy to just get dragged into the story, right? And that's why we have to be so careful in this time of a weaponized attention economy. There is money to be made off of your emotional overwhelm, and your emotions are not for sale. Yeah. Learning how to work with your emotions is a huge aspect of becoming an off-ramp for yourself. and then to become an off-ramp for others because you're not walking around like a polarized emotional automaton who looks at Republicans or Democrats and thinks evil, right? Or fool or whatever. You actually have an inner life. You actually are you're an individual. You are not a member of a group that cannot speak to the other group. There is no one who wins when that kind of polarization is being thrust upon us and manipulated. They're manipulating us into it. The only people who win are the ones in power, and that's not me, and that's not you. So take the reins back. Your emotions are not for sale. I took 4 episodes to talk about the cultic mechanisms of control that are happening everywhere around us. It's very, very strong right now in politics, much, much stronger on the right, but the left has it too. Because we don't understand cultic mechanisms of control, and they're not hard to understand. I did it in 4 episodes 3, 4, 5, and 6. You can look at a kind of a brilliant model of cultic control written or developed by the international cult researcher Janja Lalich. She and I wrote a book together about children who got out of cults. It's called Escaping Utopia. And this is my favorite model of cults because it's simple. It's accessible. What she says is a cult is just an abusive relationship. It's not just if you've been in a cult, it's not just, there's a lot going on. You lose a lot. But a cult is also just a social group. And they are using social group tactics that every social group does. Every family, every relationship uses these. But the cults twist them so that everything benefits the leaders and almost nothing benefits the group, right? The leaders and the cadre around the leaders of the special magic people, right? But everybody else is kind of enslaved by the vision. And by the control mechanism, the influence mechanisms, yes? The reason I talked about that is because if you want to be an off-ramp for yourself and you're in a group like that, you need to understand exactly what is happening and how this group is using these mechanisms of control, yeah? Also, in each episode 3 through 6, I talked about what does it look like when you've got a group that isn't using cultic mechanisms of control. What does it look like to have a healthy leader instead of a power mad one? What does it look like to have healthy influence instead of people trying to control you all the time, emotionally and socially? What does it look like to have a transcendent belief system that isn't toxic? Because many of them are, right? What does it look like to have a belief system that is welcoming and leads to freedom instead of imprisonment in the ideas of the cult, right? It's so important to understand that because I think this is something that people just don't even want to think about, but too bad, we're going to think about it. When someone is under cultic control, they are being abused. They're abuse victims. They are not acting of their own volition. They're not acting on their own ideas. They're not acting on their own heart and soul. They've been manipulated. And you don't come to a manipulated person with a lot of fire saying you're a Nazi and you're this and you're that, because you're just going to abuse them again, right? If you know how your emotions work and you know how emotions work on you, you won't use that kind of rage and hysteria and paranoia in the presence of people who are actively being abused and controlled. Yes? Think about, have you ever done any kind of work with abused animals? Dogs, cats, horses. And the way that you have to be around that animal so that you don't add to the problem. You just have to calm your whole self down if you have that capacity, and maybe not make direct eye contact because the animal has just sort of had it in this life. And through that trusting relationship, through being a loving, trustworthy presence, that animal may think, okay, you're cool. And that may be a part of the healing. If you've ever known someone who's in an abusive marriage, abusive relationship, do you go and yell at them? Right? Do you go and say, how can you stay in this relationship? You might want to, but you don't do it if you're any kind of intelligent, right? Because that just adds insult to injury. Yeah. You would, if you know what you're doing, stay on the outside of that relationship, maintaining the connection, knowing that the person is being controlled and abused, and you would be a safe space, just like you are with animals, that you're going to calm yourself down and not make eye contact. You're going to remind that animal that it's okay to be with other beings and it's not always horrible. You're going to remind your friend who's in that terrible relationship about things that are funny about them, about things they love, about things they find beautiful, right? You hold a space for them in what I call, what do I call it? It's like empathy, temporal empathy. That's what it is. Temporal empathy is empathy for a person who's going through hell right now. And you hold a vision of them. I remember how funny you are. I remember how good you were at this game or piano or math. I remember your dreams, right? Sometimes you're holding the essence of the person inside you, and I don't mean that in a metaphysical way. You're just holding a vision of the person and leaning in and reminding them of who they are. Maybe you can't do anything or say anything about the group they're in or the political activities they're involved in or the relationship they're in, but you can maintain your humanity, your dignity, your empathy, and your communication and connection to that person, knowing that they are in trouble, or that animal, knowing that they are in trouble. The same thing is happening here. Certainly on the right, tremendous levels of cultic control happening throughout the scape, through the media, the social media, through leadership. It's really strong right now. And on the left, though, we are not hidden from it, because there's a lot of stuff going on the left, in the left, which is a part of paranoia, hatred, rage, depression, and people are sharing that in a way that is basically emotionally abusive. If you're not okay, it's time for you to take care of yourself instead of trying to create groups of people who are as not okay as you are. Yeah, that is a way to become an off-ramp to yourself. It's also a way to become an off-ramp to the people in your sphere of influence, so that you are not constantly filled with doom and rage that you don't even know how to work with. Rage is a powerful emotion that has a powerful job to do, but spreading it all over your social group is not the job of rage, right? Depression is a very powerful emotion. It has very important things to say to you. And I talk about that there's a depression episode. Which one is it? Where is the depression episode? Episode 14. You need to listen to your own depression, but spreading it out in your family and friends circle and your social media, spreading out your depression, that is a very poor emotional hygiene, because your depression speaks to you and other people's depression speaks to them. You don't transmit it so that everybody's feeling your depression. That's not okay. They're not supposed to be working your emotions. You are. And remember that if you don't know how to work with your emotions, and how many of us do, we weren't taught. But if you don't know how to work with your emotions, and if you don't work with your emotions, someone else is going to work them for you, which is why your emotions are not for sale. Yeah. I also wanted to focus on, I'll tell you 3 quick stories about 3 cultic abusive relationships I was in, and how the people around me either were or were not off-ramps. The first was a cult I was in from age 10 to 17 when I was kicked out. Our family split up around our entry into this kind of new age world. When I was 10, my parents divorced, partly about this, because my mom had become a yoga teacher and a vegetarian, and it was really very, very 1970s. But my dad was very, no, this doesn't make any sense. And instead of talking or arguing or supporting my mom and the rest of us, they just divorced and took one of my brothers with him. And so the family just fell apart. And so being involved in the new age and yoga and vegetarianism and auras and chakras and channeled beings was a way for some of us to show loyalty to my mother's point of view inside, and to be openly sarcastic about what many of us were doing, I was a way to show loyalty to my father's view, right? So it was very split open. And in my family, there was no off ramp. Half of us were involved in that world, and the other half were very antagonistic to that world. And I remember my brother just saying, basically saying, you cannot be intelligent and believe in any of this nonsense, right? And I mean, that was a terrible, he was young, he was in his teens, so he gets a pass. But it had the opposite effect. Trina, you call me unintelligent? Let me show you. Let me show you that this is intelligent or whatever, right? It didn't bring me out. There was no opening to come out unless I put my head down and said, yes, I'm stupid, right? And you're right. And, please help me. That wasn't going to happen. So trying to get out of that cult, they finally threw me out, which I think, thank you. But there was no place for me to land, right? I think, did I go? My dad and I began to have a relationship, and I don't know if my brother and I fixed my relationship at that point, but there was no off ramp for me. There wasn't. It was I got pushed out of the car. That was my off ramp. So that was nobody helped. And the people who were in the cult still, after I got thrown out, they had these divided loyalties between me, who was in their family, and the cult leader who was, someone hugely important to us. So that was bad. The second experience was my abusive first marriage. It was very bad. And my husband was heading into paranoid schizophrenia or schizoaffective depression. I don't know, and I don't think he does either, because he was never diagnosed and he was never treated. So it took off. And we ended up homeless. I ended up in a battered women's shelter. It was a lot. And my family saw it. I also disappeared from my family for 2 years, and we went undercover. When I came back, my family realized that they were going to have to really be very smart about this, because any challenge to my husband or my relationship, because I was so loyal to him and we were in so much schizophrenia caused chaos all the time, that I was just, juggling and holding on to keep our lives together to the extent that I could. So I was attached to him. They saw it. And what they did was they kept connection with me. They invited me to things. They would come over to the house, although he didn't want anyone to come into the house. He was isolating me. And like pay attention to his rules and kind of put their head down. He was 22 or 23 and they were all adults, but they wanted access to me and they didn't want to endanger me, right? And when I finally left, after I ended up in a battered women's shelter, our son was 5. It was 5 years of chaos, 6. I remember my sister said this one thing to me: you didn't laugh when you were with him. And I was like, yeah, that was it. And my dad said one thing to me. He had more trouble than any 2 people I've ever met. And that was it. there was no shaming of me. How could you do that? How could you stay in that relationship for that long? I was doing enough of that shaming inside myself, yes. And a lot of it was necessary, because how did that happen? But that was a great off ramp, because they maintained whatever connection they could when I was in danger, right? And I'm sure that if they didn't know what to do, they would have just been, throwing emotion all over the place. How can you do this? He's hurting you, blah, blah, blah. I was able to come out of that, having learned my lesson, with my family, still my family, right? Nobody stopped talking to me. Nobody made grand gestures. Well, I won't invite you over until you get rid of that husband, right? They somehow knew to do it there. And probably because it wasn't a cultic thing, it was, everybody kind of understands abusive relationships. So I think they had a different view of it, right? The third off ramp that I didn't have was, I wrote about it in the book that we started out with this whole podcast series, is Missing the Solstice. It is, after I'd been in that cult, after I'd been through a number of difficult situations, I still wanted to hold on to what was good in the New Age, and what was good in the metaphysical community, and what was good in the spiritual healing community, right? Because I felt like there was something there. And so I built this whole career. And what was it? When did I start? Was this a 20-year career? Wrote books and audio learning programs, and I toured, and I tell the story of Missing the Solstice, but I realized, oh my God, this is not a good place. I don't want to be here. I don't want to stand for this. I can't. And I ended my whole career. I took whatever books I could control out of print. I closed down my website. I disappeared from public life. You could still do that back then. This is before the internet, lives in your pocket. And I had nowhere to go. Everybody that was in my family and everybody that I loved was in that community, right? They were all in the New Age, metaphysical, spiritual healing world. And they still loved me, those who stayed around. I did lose a lot of friends. I didn't lose any family, though. That's important, because they had already learned how to stay by me in times of terrible trouble. But they couldn't understand the transition that I made. They could stand by me, but be like, why would you give up your career? That was a really important career. They couldn't understand how I could see so much trouble, but they also didn't go where I went. They didn't write the books. They didn't tour throughout the whole New Age community. They weren't a headliner. They didn't see what happened to people, right? They didn't have my experiences, so they couldn't understand it. But I was so alone. And the off-ramp that I did have was the skeptical community of that time, who were just absolutely terrible at emotional tone and at welcoming. They were very, the reason that you have these beliefs is because you're a dupe and a fool. And come over here where intelligent people do intelligent things, right? So I tried to be in that culture for a little while, but I was like, this is not good. I don't want to go from the frying pan into I don't even want to call it a fire. It was just heads on fire. It was a mess. So I really was alone. Thank goodness I had gone to school. So the people who grabbed me, the culture that I was able to move into, was social science research, sociological research. And that became my off-ramp. But they weren't there to do that. They were there to help me learn how to do research. And the becoming an off-ramp just happened as a byproduct of that. So I had 2 zero off-ramp situations and one pretty strong off-ramp situation with my abusive marriage. And of course, I've been thinking about this since then. How do you get out? How do you help people get out? What do you need to know? What skills do you need to have? Is there something special about people who get out? Or is this something we can all do? And I told you a line from the movie Philadelphia Story, and the line is, the time to make up your mind about people is never. Which means don't give up. Like my family didn't give up on me. And I'll tell you a secret. My first husband, I will love him till the day I die. And I'm not having him in my life. I'm not having him in our son's life. He doesn't have my credit cards, right? But the time to give up on him is never, right? I need to, keep him at an arm's length. And luckily, he didn't chase after me. He doesn't have the stalker vibe. And that's a part of the reason that I love him, right? He could have gone that way. He was a troubled guy, but he didn't, because he's got this core inside him of ethics and morals. And so I will always wish him well. I will never give up on him. There's a couple of people I gave up on. No, I rarely give up on anybody, right? Because you don't know. So if you've got people who are in, for instance, QAnon, which is people like, is QAnon a cult? I'm like, what about it isn't a cult? It's culty, cult. It's so cultish. It's brilliant in how it entraps people. Brilliant, not in a good way. I can still see intelligence even when the outcome is bad. If you've got people in QAnon just filled with, this horrendous paranoia that is being, placed into them, and their emotions are being manipulated all the time. And you think, I just need to get rid of that person. I just need to close it off. If that person's being abusive to you, yeah, close it off. But when do you make up your mind about people? Never. There should always be a part of you that sees the potential of people, even if you need to create some separations now. There's always enough time for every important thing. And knowing that people in cults like QAnon are being actively abused, actively manipulated, and their emotions are being worked for them, not on behalf of them. They're being worked for the empowerment of the top of the cultic structure. This is how all cults work. The people are like little batteries that are feeding into the top structure, either the individual or the cadre, right? And what do you do when people are being abused and manipulated and hurt? How do you behave toward them? What are your choices? Is it, do you want to go scream at them? Let's go scream. Let's go find an abused dog and scream at it. Let's see how that's going to work. Yeah. Something I saw when we were talking to Doug Teschner and Beth Mallow of Beyond the Politics of Contempt is that they said you need to be kind to people. You need to be kind and nice. And I think a lot of people who are riled up on the left and the right are like, no, you never should be kind to those people because they're all criminals. And they, right? Where's that going to end up? And as Doug Teschner said, what's your end game here? Where's this going to go? And people don't think of an end game when their emotions are that riled up and they don't know how to work with their emotions, right? So they become weaponized. Their emotions become weaponized. I see it on the left. I see it on the right. And what I'm saying as, a person who's been through cults, who's been through abuse, who's found off-ramps, who's become an off-ramp is, that's a losing game. The only winning move is not to play. And the kindness isn't weakness. Kindness isn't agreeing with the person. My parents and my siblings were kind to me when I was in that abusive relationship. Was that kindness saying to me, what your husband doing is right? No, the kindness was something that they were offering to me. They weren't erasing what was happening to me, right? Even though they couldn't talk about it out loud, because I would have fought, I would have defended him to the death, and almost did, right? They just were safe docking stations for the part of me that was still me and wasn't stuck in all this. If you don't have that in you, if you can't do that right now, then I would ask you to stop engaging, because your inability to manage your emotional response to the fact of other people's emotions being weaponized is something that's very understandable, but it's going to create more trouble. Yeah. People who are in cults are already overwhelmed. Their emotions are overwhelmed. Parts of their ability to reason are overwhelmed. They're mostly being gaslit. They're being intentionally confused. They're being intentionally made to see outsiders as fools or losers or demons, right? They're weaponized. And coming back from that requires a lot of kindness. It requires a social structure, if any can be created, that they can veer off and take an off-ramp and have a soft landing. I had two really hard landings, and I would love it if not everybody had to experience that. Yeah, that's why I'm here. Thank you for being here. This episode 16 is the final episode in the first, what is it, season? Look at me, I've got seasons. This is the final episode in the first season of the Off-Ramp Project. In season 2, we're going to go even deeper. We started it out with what's happening in cultic control and what's happening with your emotions. Now we're going to look at the structure of the cultic control that we're seeing now. There's QAnon, there's MAGA, there is the kind of strange enforcement of a national religion, which I didn't agree to it, right? But that's been building for almost 100 years. And it's very insidious. It's kind of everywhere. People were like, how did the Supreme Court all of a sudden become these group of, like, what happened? It's been happening for a while. And so we look at what are we facing? And then how do we create off-ramps for everybody? What could be an off-ramp for that? I also want to talk to people like me who left their cults and left their previous persona, their careers, their families, their lives. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. I'm not really interested in the stories of people. I'm not disinterested, but in terms of this project, I want to see the stories of the people who left when everything would say that they should stay, because they were losing everything, or it seemed that way. People like the late, great Mike Rinder, who was full-on Scientologist. He was absolutely Scientology, 101. And he would fight for it. And he left, even though he lost his children. I want to look at Derek Black, now Adrienne Black, who was the beloved child of the white supremacy movement here in the United States, the godson, now goddaughter of David Duke, the KKK Grand Wizard, breaking everyone's hearts when Adrienne decided to leave, when the problems of white supremacy and white nationalism became so clear that there was no way to go but out. That is a story I want to hear about, right? I don't want to hear about people like, I bought too much Mary Kay, I'm $20,000 in debt and this is an MLM or whatever. I don't want to see people who just sort of got manipulated into it. I want to see people like me who had every single thing to lose and still they left. And I couldn't be happier in my new life, in a life that I built based on my own ideas and not on the ideas of the New Age or metaphysics or spirituality, but my own ideas, my own moral core, my own intelligence. And and build something new that I could stand by. And I think each of the people who left really gave us a picture of how lives are rebuilt. Even if you went, 1,000% down on the belief system that you had. When we look at people who are so rabidly in the cultic areas of the right, and you think, how does this even? These people are weaponized. These people are seeing monsters everywhere. It's terrifying what's happening, and I don't know how we get out of it. How we get out of it is by becoming safe spaces for each other. It's by telling stories of leaving behind ideas that you thought were really great at first, but then turned out not to be. Telling stories of leaving whole communities and looking back with love, or marriages and looking back with love. There are so many ways to leave, and so many ways to be an off-ramp for yourself and be an off-ramp for others. I'd like to explore those and talk about what we're facing, what we have faced, what may be possible in the future. Never losing hope, even though it can be seen as naivete. Knowing that the time to make up your mind about people is never. Thank you for being a part of this first season of the Off-Ramp Project. It's helped me so much in my own thinking about what I'm seeing, and my own thinking about how we become a community again, instead of fierce combatants being manipulated on both sides, in our emotions, in our attention, in our intentions, and in the way that we've been taught to see people who disagree with us. I wanted to remind you again about Braver Angels. Doug Teschner and Beth Mallow, who wrote Beyond the Politics of Contempt, are volunteers with Braver Angels. And you can go there. It's free, or I think you can pay $11 or $12 a year. And you can learn how to become depolarized, how to think about things in a new way that's not manipulative, that's not abusive, but it will actually be freeing for you and the people in your life. This isn't a sprint. We're not going to get this fixed in the next 25 minutes. This is a marathon, because what has happened to the United States has been happening over a period of years or decades or even almost a century. And if we want to become off-ramps, then it's important to know what we're facing and know what people are facing who are being used or abused or manipulated or controlled, whichever political party they're a part of. Yes? That you can't do something to one half of a community and not have the other half of the community affected terribly, right? America is a family, and we are a broken apart family right now. But like my family did, when I was in a dangerous, abusive relationship that landed me in a battered women's shelter, they stayed a family. And no matter how hard it was to come to my house or to invite me to Christmas or whatever, because they were in so much pain, they stayed a family. And I was still a member of that family, even though my husband was trying to separate me from them. They were just happy and chuckly and friendly to him. It was great strategy. I don't know how they did it, right? Their kindness, their reaching out, it seems like they didn't do anything, but they did everything. And I've experienced it. I was trapped. That was a cultic marriage. It had all four aspects of cultic control going on. And I was like a babe in the woods. I had also been trained in a cult, 10 to 17. I think I met my husband when I was 19. I was not okay. It was basically cult hopping, right? I was like, well, that cult didn't work out. How about this one? The answer was, nope, that didn't work out. But But it's important to hear stories like this because we think, oh, that person is dealing with addiction. They're never getting out. It's hopeless. That person is dealing with abuse. Their life is over. No, it's not. So many stories of people coming out of addiction. So many stories of people coming out of abusive relationships and finding their way to love, finding their way to wholeness. We're all bozos on this bus and we're all slouching toward Bethlehem. Become an off-ramp for yourself, be an off-ramp for others, and take good care of yourself. I'll see you in season 2.